Have you ever imagined that an object from outside the solar system could appear at the exact moment we finally have the technology to see every breath it takes? What if I told you that object is not simply some weird comet, not a harmless chunk of ice and rock, but something that is actively reorganizing itself right inside our own solar system, not breaking apart, not disintegrating, transforming? It sounds strange, I know, but the data doesn't lie. The first thing that caught my attention when I looked at the 3i/ATLS data was the contradiction it displayed within itself. Some models tried to explain its behavior as natural fragmentation, as if it were breaking itself apart. But the closer I looked, the more I saw the opposite. This thing isn't dying, it's changing structure. And to understand that, we have to start from the moment everything was recorded, an apparently impossible discovery. The ATLS telescope system in Chile detected a faint, small object moving in a strange curve across the sky. Just hours later, orbital data confirmed it did not originate in the solar system. This was the third interstellar object humanity has ever observed after Fumomoy in 2017 and Borisov in 2019. The probability of detecting something like this was already close to zero. Yet in less than a decade, we've witnessed three. And this time, unlike the previous two, the strangeness began from the very first second. 3i/ATLS is very small, so small it should have been nearly invisible in sunlight, yet it was abnormally bright, bright enough to force us to ask what exactly is emitting that light. When JWST began observing the object in late August, the answer didn't make the story any less bizarre. The first infrared images revealed a gigantic COAT cloud surrounding 3i/ATLS, large enough to match the distance from Earth to the Moon. No small comet can produce a material envelope on that scale. The spectrum didn't match any known pattern either. Its nickel to iron ratio lies completely outside the entire range a natural comet could possess. The organic compounds were wrong in structure, wrong in proportions, wrong even in the way nature normally forms them. And then its behavior started saying something no model could explain. It maintained steady brightness but fluctuated in regular patterns, as if systematically responding to its environment. For such a small object to produce such large signatures, there's always one explanation in engineering. Whatever is inside is far more complex. That's why I say to understand 3i/ATLS, we can't look at it the old way. We have to view it not as a melting meteor, but as an operating system. And that's where the story takes a turn no one expected. Because the strangest part isn't that it's bright or flying oddly, it's how it keeps changing according to a logic comets have never had. All the data began challenging everything we thought we knew about interstellar objects. And this is where things start getting truly weird, because just weeks after discovery, 3i/ATLS began showing a series of anomalies that, taken individually, you could shrug off with, yeah, comets do that, but when you put them together, they form a pattern that is very unnatural. First, the COAT cloud. Looking at its size, I almost asked the team, are you sure? Did the system drift in measurements? Because that cloud is thousands of times larger than predicted for such a small cometary nucleus, an object less than a mile in diameter, yet surrounded by a gas region as wide as the Earth-Moon distance. That doesn't make sense unless an extremely powerful process is ejecting material, which leads to the second anomaly, the nicel-C ratio. Every comet model in textbooks has a very narrow, very stable nickel to iron range, but 3i/ATL, it's not in that range. It's way outside, and not just a little, but enough to make spectroscopists frown. That means either it formed in a completely different environment from solar system comets, or it underwent an extreme energy event in its past, enough to rearrange its internal material. Then the organic compounds. The spectral lines show molecules unlike anything we normally see in comets, not basic organic chemistry 101, but strange combinations as if heated or processed under unusual pressure or temperature. At first, I thought it might be bad data, but then other telescopes recorded the exact same pattern. At this point, you start seeing a story not of disintegration, but of a state transition, as if the object is activating a new phase. But the clearest anomaly has to be the mass loss rate. From early August to late October, outgassing rose from a few hundred pounds per second to millions of pounds per second, a 600-fold increase in just 3 months. Normal comets don't do that. No simple natural physical process allows exponential mass loss growth like that without shredding the internal structure. Yet 3i/ATLS didn't shred. It kept its overall shape and orbital stability. That made me feel like I was watching a system operating, not an ice rock being melted. And then the acceleration, the point that made many physicists shake their heads. When an object approaches the sun, you expect stronger gravitational pull and faster motion, but you don't expect it to accelerate beyond what pure gravity predicts. 3i/ATLS did exactly that. It accelerated past the expected threshold, as if an additional force was pushing it forward. I remember joking, but not really joking. If a starship were producing that light, I'd say the propulsion system is in overload mode. And yes, the light I'm talking about is the strange blue glow surrounding 3I/AT. Wrong color, wrong spectrum, wrong intensity. That light comes from heavy metal ions like cobalt and titanium, elements that require very high energy to ionize, the kind found on the surface layers of small stars or in extremely powerful artificial energy events. Normal comets don't do that. Ice and rock don't naturally emit blue light from heavy metal ions, but 3I/AT does. At this point, if you're someone who likes to explain everything with it's just a comet, you're starting to have problems. Because this chain of anomalies doesn't stand alone. They connect like pieces of a blueprint, gigantic CO2 cloud, weird metal ratios, non-standard organic compounds, 600 Quich of mass loss increase, non-gravitational acceleration, blue heavy metal ion glow. Everything matches only one thing. 3I/AT is not behaving like a comet. It's behaving like a system undergoing a phase change, like a machine entering operational mode. And once you look at it from that perspective, everything suddenly makes a lot more sense. But then came the moment when everything went straight past anomalous and into what the hell is this? The moment that James Webb Space Telescope, one of the most sophisticated observation instruments humanity has ever built, suddenly lost the image of 3I/AT, not a temporary data glitch, not solar radiation noise, but the object completely vanished from the frame, while the background stars remained perfectly clear. It didn't fade. It disappeared from view at the exact moment its physical data was spiking to unbelievable levels. Hours later, instead of a cometary nucleus, JWST recorded a light streak stretching millions of kilometers, a thin, straight, uniformly dense streak of light, as if the object had stretched itself into a linear structure. Comets don't do that. Debris doesn't do that. Even extreme outgassing doesn't create a sharp, elongated, directionally stable light trail lasting hours. This looked like a phase change, as if the object shifted from a focus point state to an descended form, a kind of morphing we can't explain with traditional comet physics. And when you think, okay, that must have been a catastrophic explosion, the new numbers don't match the breakup hypothesis at all. When we analyzed mass loss and emitted light, the energy 3I/AT was releasing did not correspond to the amount of material it was losing. If a comet loses mass that fast through sublimation, the radiated energy has to fall within a very specific range. But 3I/AT was radiating far more, way too much compared to the ejected material. That leads to one clear conclusion. The energy isn't only coming from material sublimation. Something else inside must be active, a mechanism we don't yet understand. Nobody wants to say internal power source, but if you're an engineer looking at the graphs, you can't help but consider the possibility. Then we tried calculating the actual size of the nucleus based on energy and mass loss rates, and that's when the models completely broke. Independent calculations all showed that to produce the measured outgassing, the nucleus would have to be about 14 kilometers wide, but the observed size, less than 2 kilometers. Let me put it as simply as possible. Either the energy measurements are wrong, or the size observations are wrong, or the model we use to understand comets simply does not apply to 3I/AT. And that's when I had to stand up and say something my team has heard from me many times. When the data doesn't fit, there are only two possibilities. The data is wrong, or your model is wrong. The problem is the data comes from multiple different telescopes, multiple independent teams, multiple wavelengths, and they all tell the same story. That leaves only one possibility. The model is wrong. We're looking at something that does not obey comet physics. This was also when scientists started talking about fragmentation, that maybe 3I/AT had broken into many pieces. But the more I looked at the data, the less I believed that hypothesis. Breakup should be chaotic. Debris should scatter randomly. But 3I/AT is not chaotic. It's not scattering randomly. Every signal indicates its structure is changing in a directed way, like a system entering a new operational mode. Think of it this way, a natural object breaking apart is like throwing a rock on the ground. Pieces fly everywhere. But an engineered system disassembling is like taking a device apart. Components separate, but always in a specific order. And 3I/AT, by every observation, is behaving like the latter. The light vectors, energy distribution, elongation pattern, everything is too clean to call an explosion. If you look at it not as a comet, but as a structure-changing state, like a self-adjusting algorithm or a device switching to a second operational mode, then everything suddenly makes much more sense. It's not disintegrating, it's reshaping. And that very process leads us to the strangest observations still to come, the jets, the straight lines, the symmetrical structures that no natural phenomenon can produce. And when everything crossed the boundary of every astronomical phenomenon ever recorded, because after 3I/AT vanished from JWST's frame and reappeared as a light streak, ground-based telescopes began capturing things that completely shattered the traditional comet model. The first thing that froze the scientific community was the appearance of an anti-tail, a thin, sharp, stable band of light pointing straight toward the sun. If you've ever taken basic astronomy, you know comet tails always point away from the sun because radiation pressure and solar wind push material outward. It's practically an absolute rule in astronomy. Yet 3I/ATLS did the opposite. It produced a narrow, razor-sharp, stable band stretching directly sunward. This wasn't just strange, it was almost physically impossible under natural models. That was the first sign that this isn't a tail in the usual sense. And then as we dug deeper, we discovered it wasn't just one such feature, but a series of at least 7 distinct jets appearing simultaneously from the region around the nucleus. One of them stretched 1.77 million miles, nearly twice the Earth-Moon distance. Not only long, it was extraordinarily straight, non-diffuse, and held its shape for days. This looked nothing like any outgassing jet ever recorded in the solar system. But what made me step back and look at the big picture was this. The jets weren't pointed randomly. At least 3 others were aimed precisely at fixed coordinates on the ecliptic plane. Several more were distributed in a repeating angular and spacing pattern. When I saw the jet direction diagram, my first reaction was, nature doesn't like symmetry, engineers do. And that's true in nature, especially in sublimation of volatiles under heat. Structures are almost always chaotic, asymmetrical, changing minute by minute. But 3I/ATLS showed no chaos whatsoever. It produced a symmetrical formation with material streams like energy columns placed at exact positions, exact angles, exact directions. Then there was the on-off cycling of the jets. Instead of continuous ejection like normal comets, 3I/ATLS's jets appeared, intensified, dimmed, vanished, then reappeared, all following a measurable periodic pattern. If this were a natural system, it would depend almost entirely on ice content, temperature, surface structure, and solar illumination angle, all natural factors that produce chaos. Yet 3I/ATLS's jet pattern was stable, internally logical, almost like power modulation. I half-jokingly told a colleague, but wasn't really joking, these jets look more like thrusters than outgassing. A lot of people laughed, but a few stayed silent because they were thinking the same thing. Interestingly, the most crucial observations didn't come from NASA or JWST, but from 2 extremely well-equipped amateur astronomers with the British Astronomical Association, Michael Jagger, Nick Riemann, and a few other groups. They used modern image processing techniques, noise removal, contrast enhancement, stacking aligned to 3I/ATLS's actual motion. The result, they captured images showing not just the jets but thin light bands connecting them, as if the material streams were forming a skeleton or network. A faint structure but structured. A pattern nature has no reason to create. If you look at those images, 3I/ATLS no longer resembles a chaotic gas cloud like a normal comet. Instead, it looks like a formation, a structure being arranged. Some call it a plasma lattice, others call it directed outgassing. But I see it this way, it's the behavior of a goal-oriented system. At this point, the debris cloud hypothesis pretty much collapses. Debris doesn't organize. Debris doesn't form symmetrical formations. Debris doesn't create fixed vectors aimed at specific orbital coordinates. Debris doesn't pulse on and off in cycles. That has led some researchers to a new hypothesis. 3I/ATLS isn't breaking apart. It is undergoing controlled separation, like a probe dividing into modules, or a device entering swarm mode, a collection of smaller structures coordinating with each other, sharing energy and information. A self-organizing structure where each piece acts as a node in a larger network. I know the idea sounds insane, but when you look at the data like an engineer, instead of a traditional astronomer, it becomes the least unreasonable of the unreasonable hypotheses. If you wanted to optimize observation of a foreign star system, you wouldn't want a single object. You would want multiple modules geometrically arranged, spread through space, collecting data from many angles. That's exactly what we're seeing. Not a comet disintegrating, but a structure revealing itself layer by layer, a system stepping out of the shadows, exposing straight lines, symmetry points, shapes that nature rarely produces. And that leads us to the most frightening question. If this is a structure unfolding, what is it unfolding for? Because what happened next in radar returns, satellite data, and the reactions of space agencies shows they were thinking the same thing. And as you might expect, once the symmetrical images, thruster-like jets, and bizarre structures became clear, the story was no longer confined to amateur astronomers or the scientific community. This is when government agencies started paying attention, and when they pay attention, they never do it quietly, except this time. Because the first thing that happened wasn't press releases or scientific commentary. There was an unusual silence from NASA, no updates, no analysis, no data sharing for an interstellar event Only the third in history. That silence was so strange it was suspicious. I know politics isn't my field, but when an agency as famously transparent and open as NASA chooses silence at exactly this moment, you have to ask questions. In complete contrast, ESA ramped up public tracking, they rescheduled Hubble observations, jointly operated with NASA, and pushed analysis programs to highest priority. Some inside sources say ESA wanted to ensure Europe had independent data and wasn't reliant on reports from any single nation. That alone shows everyone realized this is not normal. But the most interesting and most worrying reaction came from two countries historically less transparent about space programs, China and Russia. Within a week of the symmetrical jets being released by the BOA and several European amateur groups, both nations simultaneously retargeted several military satellites specialized in high-orbit object tracking. Intelligence experts described it as strategic event response protocol. In other words, they regard this not just as an astronomical phenomenon, but as a potentially strategic asset. When multiple superpowers act in parallel without coordinating publicly, you can be certain they're not doing it for an ordinary comet. But what came next sent chills down everyone's spine. US and European radar recorded repeating echoes from 3I/ATLS's position, a rhythmic coded reflection signal. It wasn't natural noise. It wasn't radiation interference. It wasn't random plasma bounce. It was the kind of echo that only appears when radar waves hit a hard surface or a stable geometric structure and reflect back in a repeating pattern. And since 3I/ATLS was in a controlled separation state with no intact core left, yet radar was returning as if hitting something solid or fixed. That only deepened the question, what is really behind that dust and plasma? But there's one detail many don't want to say out loud. One of the jets has begun changing direction, and the new direction it's aiming toward, Earth's orbit, not intersecting, not colliding, but approaching orbital path, as if adjusting its vector with intent. That's the kind of behavior nature has no motive to perform. But a survey, reconnaissance, or data collection system has a very clear motive. When I saw that data, I said only one thing. That's when governments really started to worry, and they did. The US, Europe, China, Russia all shifted to strategic monitoring mode. 3I/ATLS's trajectory was no longer interesting science. It became a space security issue. Because if an interstellar object is self-restructuring, emitting directed jets, returning radar like a solid structure, and starting to adjust a vector toward the most populated planet's orbit in the system, then all the traditional scenarios no longer apply. And when all the data from jets, radar, symmetrical structures, and the silence of major agencies began piling up, the entire story naturally led to one very clear fork in the road. Either this is a physical process we have never understood, or this is an artificial structure, purposeful system, ancient or currently active, originating from somewhere else in the galaxy. There is no middle ground left. The first possibility, and the one traditional scientists want most, is that 3I/ATLS is undergoing an unknown physical process. Some researchers call it self-organization, the spontaneous organization of interstellar material under extreme conditions we can't replicate on Earth. Interstellar matter might carry strange properties, anomalous crystal structures, plasma states coupled with persistent magnetic fields, or supercold matter phases that activate upon solar radiation exposure. Another hypothesis suggests 3I/ATLS may contain compounds never seen in the solar system, a durable form of matter that easily changes structure once a certain temperature threshold is reached. Instead of disintegrating, it transforms like certain crystals, shifting from one solid phase to another when heated. Plasma physicists offer yet another angle near the sun where plasma density is high. Interactions between magnetic fields, heavy metal ions, and radiation pressure could create temporary structures, plasma cords, ion columns, or self-aligning aggregates. Those models sound scientific, but they have a major limitation. They don't explain the symmetry, they don't explain the coded radar returns, and they don't explain jets aimed at fixed coordinates. Still, if someone wants to keep everything natural, these are the hypotheses to cling to. The second possibility, and the one everyone is afraid to name but no one can rule out, is that 3I/ATLS is an artificial structure, possibly extremely ancient, possibly drifting through space for millions of years, yet still containing components that are active or reactivating near a star. If you look at the jet patterns, the structured separation, the hard body radar returns, and the vector adjustment, this scenario becomes the least absurd of the absurd hypotheses. Some scientists suggest it could be a self-repairing probe, once a larger object, but when exposed to solar heat, internal modules activated, separated, reconfigured, and formed up to complete a specific objective. Others propose it might be a signaling system where the jets aren't just energy but a communication medium, emitting pulse patterns like coded bursts, similar to how we use energy pulses in deep space communication. And if you look at how the modules are spread out, symmetrical, pointing toward multiple points on the ecliptic, its shape starts resembling an expanding sensor network, a swarm capable of collecting data from many directions, processing locally, then relaying to a central core. You don't need science fiction. That's exactly how humans are designing the next generation of space exploration technology. And yes, I said it dead serious. If you want to survey a star system, you break the system into pieces. That's the optimal way. A single object can fail. A swarm can't. A single object can only observe from one direction. A swarm can cover the entire system. A single object is bound by its orbit. A swarm can adjust each node to maintain formation. When viewed through engineering logic, the entire structure of 3I/ATL is from directed outgassing to perfect symmetry, from radar reflection to the sunward pointing anti-tail, fits the model of a purposeful artificial system far better than a comet falling apart. And at this point, the question is no longer where did it come from, but what is it doing? If it's natural, we're facing new physics. If it's not natural, then we're facing something far bigger, as all the natural and artificial hypotheses began intertwining like a web of unbelievable possibilities. We entered what I call the final observation window, the decisive period, where the remaining data will be collected before 3I/ATL disappears from human view forever and exits the solar system for good. Hubble has been scheduled for ultraviolet spectroscopy, an extremely sensitive analysis that can reveal subtle chemical composition. Even a tiny amount of anomalous metal ions or unusual molecules would be enough to expose the object's true nature. UV is the key to determining whether the high-energy reactions are natural or the response of an intentional system. At the same time, JWST continues its infrared observations throughout December, where thermal bands can tell us whether 3I/ATL has internal heat, a core temperature exceeding what natural sublimation can produce. If its core temperature is stable in cycles, that would be an extraordinarily significant sign. No natural comet maintains heat in patterns like that. But even as these observations proceed, we have to face an uncomfortable truth. By January 2026, the object will leave the solar system. It will fade rapidly, move beyond the reach of every telescope, and any unanswered questions will remain in darkness forever. That means the coming weeks are humanity's only chance to learn the real story of 3I/ATL. And of course, the biggest questions now hang over all of us. Where did 3I/ATL come from? If it originated in the ancient thick disk of the Milky Way, has it been drifting for billions of years, carrying the technology of a long-extinct civilization? Does it have a unified structure? Or are we watching a system that is separated into modules cooperating in swarm fashion, something nature has no motive to create? Are those jets control systems? They operate in cycles, at fixed angles, maintaining symmetry, very much like thrusters. And what are those radar echoes? Evidence of a hard surface, a lattice, a response signal, or something we haven't even imagined? Each of those questions could change how we see the universe or how we see ourselves. And when we put everything together, the symmetrical jets, the sunward, anti-tail, cyclic outgassing, hard structure like radar returns, the mysterious disappearance from JWST, the million-kilometer light streak, NASA's unusual silence, the strategic maneuvers of superpowers, and the chemical anomalies that match no natural model, the picture becomes clear. 3I/ATL is not disintegrating, it is forming, it is changing structure, entering a new state that may be natural in a way we don't yet understand, or it may be artificial, a system that waited millions of years to activate as it passed a star like the sun. And I always try to keep both curiosity and humility when standing before the universe. We are not the center of everything. We're just a tiny part of a much larger picture. But that also means there are countless things left for us to discover. And 3I/ATL, whatever it is giving us a beautiful lesson in staying open to the unknown. Because in a few weeks, when the final data from JWST and Hubble are released, we'll know whether those jets are control systems or just unusual plasma, whether the radar echoes are signals from a purposeful structure or a strange reflection, whether this object is a transforming comet or something far beyond our imagination. And if the universe is trying to tell us something, then maybe it's time we listened. If you want to follow every latest update on 3I/ATL, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next parts, because this story is definitely not over yet.